The name Bottesini is probably the most beautiful sounding word in the life of bass players. Everybody wants to play Bottesini, and everybody will have heard some Bottesini. And like every bass player, Bottesini is a favorite of mine and was a favorite ever since childhood. The Elegy was the very first piece of Bottesini I ever played, but that Elegy, along with the Reverie, they are probably the most well-known pieces for early engagement with Bottesini. I learned it in the edition from Rodney Slatford's York edition, which I think was published in 1978. But I will tell you a little bit more my thoughts about York edition in a minute. But the version I learned was the Elegy and Tarantella together. Now, I'll return now to why I want to talk about Rodney Slatford in York edition. In 1978, Rodney Slatford undertook the task of trying to publish all Bottesini's compositions, but he didn't quite complete the set. He's done 3 volumes. But Rodney Slatford was the very first he was the very first person to do something that has turned into urtext edition nowadays, which is to produce editions which are faithful to the original sources. Rodney's edition of the Elegy is based upon 4 manuscript versions, and it is reliable, completely and utterly. I know that there are many other editions that exist. For example, there's Caimi and various others. Some written in Suono Reale and others not. So it's important that when we do play Bottesini, we're respectful of the original intention of the man. I love the Elegy because it was the first time that I ever understood the power that music has to touch human emotions and how your own performance can have an emotional impact upon those who hear you. The other reason I liked playing Bottesini was because it dealt with the instrument in a very virtuosic fashion, very different from Dragonetti or from anything else that we play. Bottesini understood the instrument in a particular way, and all his music represents that understanding. But it is good to know also that Bottesini wasn't just a bass player. He was a very complex man and a very astute musician, and a very well-schooled musician. He was a conductor also, and he composed opera, oratorio, other instrumental music. In fact, his D major quartet won a competition, chamber music competition. And his music for the bass comes in 2 categories, purely instrumental and then those inspired by the opera. But what is true also is that bel canto, beautiful sound, associated with the opera and singing, infuses every piece of music that he wrote. And we will have to talk about bel canto as we go through this tutorial on the Elegy. Now, something to me that's very important in being an artist is that it's not just a question of playing the instrument and working harder and harder to try to make things sound better, because that doesn't work. Effort alone does not equal outcomes or good outcomes. Every performance of integrity has to have at its heart a mental representation which is well informed. And the Elegy is no different, obviously. So I have to ask you a question. What is an elegy? Dictionary definition. There are many, but in essence, an elegy is a lament for the dead, an emotional outpouring of grief, and it's usually because of the loss of a loved one, but it could also be a traumatic event. But the thing not to forget is that it's an outpouring of grief, so that everything we play in the elegy has to have that in mind. Part of our mental representation of what we are going to play also has to have an understanding of the structure of the piece and the different elements in the music. and then to think about the technical tools at our disposal in order to be able to illuminate the music. So in essence, we're merely a vehicle for the music. But it's also true to say that each one of us has an experience of loss and grief. And it is different from anybody else's. But that understanding of loss and grief has to inform our performance of an elegy. And this is why I also believe that becoming a great musician is not just done through practice, but is done through living life. If one lives protected from reality, one's music can never express anything of true value. One has to experience life in all its vicissitudes. The beautiful, the ugly, the painful, the beautiful. There's so much. Musicianship really is founded on the complexity in one's own life and one's life's experience. I remember playing this elegy in a rehearsal before an examination for my second double bass teacher, Max Runge, who was German. And before I'd completed the piece, he got to his feet, and by the time I finished, he'd walked out the door. But as he walked out the door, I noticed that he was crying. And he came back the next day and he told me that the manner in which I played that elegy had reminded him of some of the more traumatic events in his life. And that really made me understand the power of music. So the elegy to me is very special. It's the first piece of Bottesini I ever played. I was probably 16 or 17 years old when I first played it, and I've loved it ever since. It's also the very first piece I ever recorded, my first solo CD on the Meridian Records label. Elegy is on that disc, the Elegy in Tarantella. And it was the first note that I played when we recorded the disc for the microphones. It means a lot to me, this piece.